Featured in this episode is everything you need to know about sports science. Joining me is Tyler Williams, the manager of sports science for the NFL Los Angeles Rams. Tyler details the history behind this evolving field and how it provided him a unique opportunity with the team. He also explains what sports science exactly is, how he is using it with the Rams to improve performance on the field, and how you can implement sports science yourself. Enjoy!
The Prehab audio experience will teach you how to take control of your health through knowledge by optimizing performance, promoting longevity, and keeping your movement system in tune. Welcome to your host, the Prehab Guys.
So I'd like to introduce everyone to Tyler Williams. He is the manager of sports science for the LA Rams and is going into his 13th season with the team. Sports science is an evolving field, and Tyler has been at the forefront of it for the past 7 years. Today he's going to give us some insight into the field and his role with the team. So Tyler, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We've been talking about this one for a while.
We have. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. I'm really excited for this one because, like I said, we've been planning this for quite some time. I remember being on the phone with you at LAX and trying to get this scheduled. So, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your journey to where you are today, and maybe if you could give us an elevator pitch of what is sports science?
It was a little tough to get this thing scheduled. The off season for us in the last probably 5 to 10 years has really took a turn to be our busiest time. Believe it or not, in season and training camp, even though it's 7 days a week, it's we have 90 guys on the roster during the off season, and so we have a lot of testing, and that's where we want to really get every measurement process with our guys, see how they're adapting to training, see how they're recovering, and see where we want to take them. So that's our big training blocks to really build our athletes up to withstand the demands throughout the season.
Awesome. And I think with where social media is now and just like ESPN, sports coverage, sports science is a hot topic. And that's my first thought of when I hear sports science. I just think of those times when ESPN, they would like break down the mechanics of different sports or different movements, or have athletes come on and just be like the amount of force that they can generate, or this is what had to happen with this crazy catch. So I think it's really cool, and it's super exciting that, I'm sure you've seen crazy changes in the past 7 years since you really started diving into the topic.
Yeah, so I started with the team in 2004 as an intern, and I got into the sports medicine side. And so I was there for 5 years after 2007. So from 2007 to 2012, I was in the sports medicine department, and that gave me an opportunity to see where the pitfalls were from an injury side, or where pitfalls were from a performance side. And then in 2012, I dove into the sports science avenue. We started really creating a collaborative performance model. And as I took the sports science route, I had a unique lens from a medical side and a performance side to kind of blend how these new technologies are coming out. And in 2012, it really started all these technologies that can measure athletic movement, from an accelerometer, a GPS device, a force plate. There was a big push for teams to be data-driven. Hey, let's use data analytics, all these buzzwords. Hey, let's really fine-tune how we're training these athletes. And per se, in that time frame, making decisions on data where you didn't really have a foundational knowledge behind it is kind of putting the cart before the horse. And what happens is, as you make decisions like that, it's kind of building a house on stilts. And so at the same time, we knew from our standpoint, we wanted to collect as much information on these athletes as we could. In the past, you kind of play with a 25 to 100 piece puzzle of these athletes. Well, this technology is enabling us to play with a 2,000 piece puzzle. So we can really accurately find out what pieces are missing, what pieces need to change to fit accordingly for that athlete.
And like you said, it's the amount of testing. I know what took so long to make this talk happen was that you were so busy with the testing. So
Yeah.
could you, for whatever you can share with us, are you able to tell us a little bit about the testing that you guys were doing during the off season?
Yeah. So like I said, the off season is our main big training blocks to get guys movement patterns better, or get them stronger, or get them faster by increasing some range of motion, or how we're transitioning from our phase to phase of training, from a volume or intensity aspect of how much they're running on field, how fast. So one of the things we want to do is first start with the demands of the sport and understand the demands globally, understand the demands positionally, and understand the demands individually. That way, for example, if your defense in football runs a 3-4, 4-3 scheme, well, that puts different demands on the linebacker. If that linebacker has to just rush, or does he have to drop back in coverage, or does he have to go sideline to sideline, will be dramatically different on how we want to train them. So a unique saying that I liked for hamstring strains is the vaccine for hamstring strains is sprinting. So by stressing those tissues appropriately and accurately, you can protect an athlete by making the athlete more robust.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the things we'll test in the off season are like a dual plate, force plate jump. So we do counter movement jumps, we do squat jumps, we do some single leg jumps. And then from all of our on-field running, we do like a heart rate assessment at the beginning to see what type of fitness level they're in, how many yards they're accumulating through different drills. And then that also helps, like I said, gain more puzzle pieces and more objective information to understand what that athlete has to take on from the demand side. And then if an athlete doesn't have an injury, we know how to phase them back in appropriately because we have all these pieces of information.
So with all the testing that you guys recently did in the off season, and we were just talking a little bit earlier about how camp is coming up, how will some of the results of those tests influence what happens in camp? Maybe you could share insight as to, since you guys really started diving into this 7 years ago, maybe how have things evolved each year from off season to camp to preseason? I think that would be cool to discuss.
Yeah, I think it gives us a little bit of an accurate roadmap. Beforehand, I think we were going from A to B, and now it's like using GPS on your phone. You take a wrong turn and you get 3 different reroutes. The more information has given us a ability to have more pathways to get to A to B. So, for example, if we want to progress into training camp accordingly and have a really good periodization of training, we know how to alter that, if that makes sense. And then how we want to transition from a 90-man roster to a 50-man roster from training camp to in-season.
Mm-hmm.
Or also understand some of the demands of our schedule. Are we flying East Coast? Do we have a Monday night game? How are we altering how we practice, or how we prescribe exercise to get the desired adaptation we want to put us in the best chance to succeed and lower the risk of injury?
It's funny how you bring up traveling to the East Coast. I just did it last week, and I have a Whoop, and it measures like your sleep, your recovery, heart rate variability, and
Mm-hmm.
as soon as when I get to the airport, it's like, okay, well, how am I going to stay consistent with my sleep? Should I change the time on my watch now? All right, if I need this many hours, I get into Philly, I got to try to calm down at this point and get up at this point, and I'm trying to do fasting. And it's like, I'm not a professional athlete. Why am I doing this to myself?
Yeah.
Am I actually going to be consistent with it? Awesome. So in terms of sports science, again, just coming back to the general topic as well, what do you find so interesting about sports science? Like, how are you how are you sharing the information with the players compared to how you're sharing the information with colleagues compared to the coaches? Is this information being shared with, higher officials in the league? I just think just feel free to chat about anything sports science right now. And because I think there's just a lot that people don't necessarily know.
Yeah, I think for me, sports science is really anything that you can measure on an athlete to get an objective measurement, and then um, implement a change or implement a different type of stimulus and then measure that outcome. So sometimes it's not, sports science to me kind of gets the name a little bit of, hey, do you do GPS?
Mhm.
What player tracking system you have? Well, sports science isn't just GPS. It's really an all integrated, multidisciplinary approach of just collecting as much information as you can and setting up some models to test and retest and figure out which stimulus is getting your best response to training. So, for example, sometimes too, it's not this big, detailed, expensive technology. Sometimes it's just tracking what you're doing from a load perspective, from a running perspective. If you were in the weight room and you wanted to squat 400 pounds, you wouldn't just say, well, I'm just going to squat every day and do a straight line linear progression to 400 pounds. You're probably going to fail. So it's just like you record weights in the weight room. We're recording yards and we're making sure that as we get to those certain milestones, and sometimes we want to really drive a high workload or a high stimulus and then get that adaptation, but we also have to have different recovery days in as well. So that way we're not kind of squatting heavy every single day and then have that kind of fatigue and fallout effect.
Yeah. And I love that. I tell patients and clients all the time, you can't manage what you don't measure. I mean,
Exactly.
it can just be as simple. The simplest thing for the average viewer right now is just your weight. If you want to manage your weight, well, you have to track your weight, and you have to impose changes. So, do you go calorie deficit, or do you increase your physical activity? It's just how many you're adjusting the equation, but in order to even start with the equation, you have to measure something.
Yeah. For example, if you have a guy coming off an ACL, reconstruction, and you start to run or you start to progress some deceleration components, um, how are you saying, hey, let's go run 50%? Well, how do you know what 50% is unless it's just on a subjective feeling of themselves?
Yeah.
By tracking this stuff, we know that, hey, if this guy's max capacity from a speed standpoint is 20 miles per hour, we know 50% is at 10. And sometimes we can just hand calculate that on the fly as we're running a guy. Or we say, hey, he normally runs, 5,000 yards. We know where to start him out from a starting standpoint. The same way you'd progress um, a loading progression from eccentric, a squat progression from a post-surgical knee injury. It's the same way. We're just blending performance, technology, and medicine all into one.
And that's where I'm very jealous because you have so much information. And sometimes they can get turned off and sort of pushed away by the thought of too much information. But as long as you know what to do with it, and you're not just measuring things for the sake of measuring things, it's
Yes.
because I have patients come in all the time, and there's things that I just wish they had a hard number on, because
Yeah.
they would make it a lot easier to program stuff. So
And even some of the subjective stuff, just tracking subjective diet and sleep.
yeah.
Even if it's not objective, but just subjectively doing it consistently. There's a lot of research papers out there where the subjective RPE, so the rate of perceived exertion, on how hard their exercise was, or just tracking their duration. Just duration on field or duration in the weight room or duration during a workout tells you a lot tracked over time.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think for me too, simple works and simple is actionable. So with this world of all this data, the more complex you get, the harder it is to make an accurate decision because it's a complex problem. And that goes into play. Like I believe here we do a phenomenal job. We have amazing physical therapists. We got a great dietitian. We have great strength staff, and we all communicate very well together. But we communicate simple stuff. And if you can't do that, like if your communication patterns aren't good from a multidisciplinary approach, then dumping in complexity from a technology is never going to happen.
Yeah, and like you said, keeping it simple makes it much more easy to be actionable about it, because at the end of the day, I'm sure you have to get buy-in from players, and as much information that you guys have. Like someone commented, are you tracking diet and sleep? I mean, I'm curious, are the players doing this? How much, you know, there's certain things that the players would have to write down and measure as well in
Yeah.
order to make it coherent and cohesive.
Yeah, and there's also certain aspects where we run into hurdles from a collective bargaining agreement between the players' union and the NFL on things that we can't track outside the building,
Hmm.
like sleep and stuff like that. But we can also track it subjectively in here. So we could ask the players, how much did you sleep last night? How well did you sleep? There's some decent models done before in the past that some people have done with just tracking subjective sleep. And then also our dietitian does a great job of tracking diet from a individual aspect with each player, but then also like doing some simple things as far as matching the identity of how you're fueling your athletes to match the identity of what you're trying to achieve from a workload side that day. Do you have a high volume in the weight room? Is this a day where you're or is it all very intense? Or is today kind of more of an active recovery day? Well, your fueling strategy should also parallel that. And so that sounds super simple, but it's very rarely done, I think, in the aspect of team sports from a collegiate side to a professional side.
You ever have that instance where in the past you eat really bad, you have like a terrible weekend of sleeping, and then you're like, oh, I gotta crush myself in the gym. It's completely counterintuitive now. It's like, no,
Yes, yeah.
I'm not recovered. I probably shouldn't do this.
Right. It's like dumping stress on top of stress.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's a great analogy we use sometimes as far as like a bank account. You have X amount in your bank account from a body standpoint. And every time you do some type of cost, whether it's running, whether it's working out, whether it's not enough sleep or a hard practice, you're making a withdrawal. And if you're not making enough deposits, whether it's from fueling or sleep, or you get a bad weekend of sleep or a great weekend of sleep where you make a lot of deposits, eventually that bank account, when you try to make a withdrawal, is either going to say, okay, go ahead and make a withdrawal, or you have insufficient funds.
Yeah.
And I think the times where you're getting close to those insufficient funds, the closer you get to that, the greater increase of risk from a soft tissue injury or another injury or a breakdown or a decrease in performance occurs.
Next time I manage someone that likes finances, I'm totally using that. They're going to eat that up.
Absolutely.
So let's transition into talking about your current role and your responsibilities with the team and how it all ties into this performance approach.
Yeah. So my role, I kind of transitioned, like I said, from the sports medicine side, and I was kind of doing a dual role, kind of 50-50 split. And now it's a majority of it is just the sports science side. So I manage our player tracking on field from, a GPS or radio frequency identification system, all our force plate jumps, our subjective wellness questionnaires, our schedule management a little bit with where we want to push guys and pull. And then I basically take all that data and I'm monitoring that and then analyzing it with some of our analytics department as well, and then trying to, as much as I can, bridge gaps of communication with whether it's coaching staff, sports medicine, our physical therapist, our nutritionist, or our strength staff, and making sure the data is getting to everybody. And the same data across the board so everyone can see the same thing and we can make a collective decision. We're huge on collaboration here, but we're one of our player engagement, Jock McClendon, kind of uses the term collaboration. We turn it to collaboration. And I love that because it's very progressive and it's actionable, and we're not just looking at the data and we're not just kind of collecting it, but we're finding whether it's very simple, but trying to keep every system closed loop where we're assessing it, we're monitoring it, we're analyzing it, and we're implementing an action to create a change.
Yeah, so you collect all this data, you're sort of helping overlook it and organizing it. Then what happens will you collaborate with the rest of the medical staff? Will you collaborate with the strength coaches? And then is it on them to create programming? Or, if any insight that you can share?
Yeah, I think when I first started doing this, I would collect something and find something that I felt like was connected to maybe a pitfall, but it was hard to change. It just might be something that, hey, this is part of the sport and this is what we have to do to be successful. So now I kind of start at the end. Hey, is this problem we're having, is there a good solution? Could we potentially change it? Well, how do we measure it? And kind of work backwards from an implementation side. And then I'll pull together some strategies that I think could increase a positive change, and then take them to our director of sports medicine and performance, Reggie Scott, and then Ted Rath, our head strength coach, and then the rest of our performance department, and we'll kind of make a collaborative decision. We'll throw it up on the grease board and say, hey, what do we think here? Does anybody have any different viewpoints from their lens that might be beneficial to kind of tweaking that change?
That's cool. And this all ties back into the workload management. There are some demands of the sport that sometimes you just can't change, and it is what it is. But within the past 7 years, what would you say are some of the big highlights that you've seen that have changed, or some of the things that you're really excited about that maybe you're currently working on, or like, hey, this is what I always love, and I never thought of this before until I really started practicing and I was in school. But for athletes that go deep into the playoffs, their season was significantly longer than every other player that didn't go that far.
Yeah.
So it's like I look at the longevity of someone like LeBron James, and he's been in the league for quite some time, but technically you should probably add a few seasons, because look at he's had a whole career in like postseason basketball. So yeah, I would love to hear what's maybe something that you guys are focused on this year, just learning from last year.
Yeah, I think a lot of it for us is, a good friend of mine, Darren Burgess, who I reached out to when I first started this, and he works in European soccer. He told me a lot of this stuff with sports science that you're going to get into, it's never going to win you any games. And I was like, well, why am I doing it? And he said, but it's going to keep you from losing some. And that really resonated with me, that it's not more important than your athlete or your coaching strategy, but it's a piece of that pie that if you train accordingly and you're not overworked, well, you're in a better ready state to perform if that game goes in overtime and the controllable boxes that you checked were great fueling, great preparation. You didn't overwork throughout the week. You have the capacity to take that game to overtime and potentially win.
Mm-hmm.
So that really resonated with me. From a schedule side, from a workload management, I think sometimes it's just matching your workload with the demands and the identity of what you're trying to achieve. And it sounds so simple. It's just not easy. It's hard to structure a team sport where the more you practice, the better you get at that sport. But the more you practice, the more cost is that's on the body.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to continually go above and below that cost line to make sure you're not overworked, or on the other side, underprepared. Because for us, that's kind of two ways we look at a risk of workload management is too much is overworked, and you're in a fatigue state, so you have a higher risk of not performing well or an injury occurring. And underprepared, the tissues are just at risk for an injury because you're not, it'd be like taking a jump from 200 pounds to 400 pounds and not stimulating the bones and the muscles and your neurological system to handle that heavier weight. So we want to minimize those gap jumps of workload. And one of the things, I guess, for us that I'm super excited about going into the future is, as people are figuring out kinematic movement analysis, whether it's from a video biomechanical perspective or accelerometer perspective. Force plates are allowing us to understand the kinetic variables a little bit of what's occurring. But now from a kinematic side, or as that technology gets better from video or accelerometry, you're able to understand, are those numbers you're seeing coming from the hip, or are they coming from the knee, or are they coming from the ankle, or are they coming from the torso? And I think that will really have a great impact on our return to play strategies or exercise prescription strategies in the future.
And these are wearables that I'm assuming these guys are using.
Yeah, the wearables we use are mainly our RFID system, which is a radio frequency positional XY system. So we have sensors set up around the field, and there's sensors in each stadium from Zebra Technologies. And it's funny, they really started out with tracking hospital equipment from a radio frequency identification tag. And so those monitor that XY positional information so many times per second, and it gives you an accurate representation of how far they're running or how fast they're running.
Yeah.
So those are wearables we use. We also use like a polar strap to get a wearable from a heart rate perspective that's combined with GPS. But from a wearable side, really, other than that, that's about it.
Yeah. Do you see? I'm sure someone's has to be working on it, but wearables for during practice or during games that's giving you that kinematic information of actual alignment and angles. And how long have you guys been using the force plates?
We've been using the force plates now for about 3 years.
Okay.
So just to understand how athletes are, absorbing force or transferring force or reproducing force. These elite athletes are master compensators. So a lot of times for us, it's super hard to pick it up with your eye. Some of the initial movement strategies you can, especially returning from injury, but some of these guys can overcome so many things that they've figured out how to overcome movement impairments so well that it's hard to pick up with your eye. So some things you might see look pretty good, and you put them on a force plate, and it's like, man, that's a pretty decent sized asymmetry, whether it be through an eccentric phase or concentric phase. And then now you're really hitting the drawing board of trying to find actionable strategies from an exercise prescription standpoint to alter those metrics.
Someone commented earlier about some of the challenges and any advice with ACLs, and that can be a whole nother talk and talks that we've done.
Yeah.
And even the average person can get really good with compensating after an ACL reconstruction. At the clinic that I'm at, my wife, she came up with this great idea. We just have 2 weight scales, and every single ACL that comes in, they squat with both feet on the weight scales. It's a cheaper version of a force plate, but it gets the job.
Yeah. But it's again, like you said, you don't know if you don't measure it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at least if you're consistently measuring that as they come in and step on both weight scales and do a squat, and every time they come in, they do that either before or after their session, you're seeing progression or degression. And then you're seeing how that trend is going with an opportunity to change the stimulus to get a different outcome. And to me, that's true sports science. Some people don't look at that, and I think sometimes everyone wants it to be this algorithm equation and big complex analysis, but sometimes it's just trying to find the simple things that you can change, so you can really truly understand what it is you're affecting.
And I think we can blame ESPN for that, because it makes it look cool. It's flashy,
Yeah, it is.
Let's put these elite athletes in the lab and just put all these formulas on the screen and make it look very complicated. But it's hard to reproduce that when you have a roster of more than 50 guys. And is it feasible? Is this actionable? So that's cool. It's always fun having talks with anyone that works for big teams or big organizations, because the resources that you guys have, and how what you're able to measure and what you can actually take action on, it's just so different than the average case.
Yeah.
So with that being said, we've talked a little bit about your role, your responsibility. We've dabbled here and there with workload management. I love that. I think a lot of the times I've heard some other talks, and sports, it's such a high threshold movement. It's a high threshold activity that if you really push it, it's good. You have to, because you have to impose specific adaptations that you want. But that, just a recap, that finance analogy that you use, that's excellent. Take a big withdrawal, but then you gotta do a bigger deposit. So let's transition and talk a little bit about in-season management. So you get all this data during the off season. You do all this testing. I'm sure, and it's always testing, no matter when, right? But how does that information then, how do you take action on it in season? And then we can go into some rehab versus performance protocols. I know people would love to hear about that, whatever you're able to share.
Yeah, I think how you take action on that is sometimes you have to wait and track it over time.
Yeah.
We tracked some of our measurements over a couple of years before we were quick to make a decision. And I think you have to do that. You have to be slow to make decisions. It's a new world, as you've seen, as you use ACL progressions. I mean, how much have those changed each decade with how we used to cast them, So, I mean, now it's like, hey, let's move as much as we can. And so I think you have to be very slow to make actionable changes. And you have to understand, what does your team want to achieve? What does your individual want to achieve? Does it match those goals? And it's constantly revisiting that over and over to make sure that that's really going right towards that goal. Because if not, you can easily get off course, and it's not driving you where you need to go.
Mm-hmm.
So from that standpoint, and the one thing we did to try and make changes was, again, we looked at that. Are you over-prepared? Overworked, or are you underprepared? So as you have starters and your second team and your third team and you have rookies, the one thing we did in the past is we went to a coach and said, hey, this group of guys isn't running enough, and started there. So we kind of gave back to the coach, if you will, and said, hey, here's the guys you need to practice harder. And then in turn, a couple of weeks later, we said, hey, here's some of the guys we need to pull back on. He was much more apt to say, yeah, let's go ahead and pull these guys back. So it was an education component and a buy-in for a coaching staff to, because a lot of times it's hard to talk to a coach. But I think, too, the sports science world of performance is blending and bridging a gap to what you can talk to with coaches. Because they understand performance, they understand the measurement side, but they might not understand the medical restriction side or some of the performance limiting side. So this technology creates a common ground to bridge that gap, to blend performance and blend tactical decision making with that.
And I think that was a part of the conversation to have. That maybe not certain that not everyone necessarily wanted to have, because it's, these are the methods that I learned, these are the results that I saw with it, and we're going to stick to it because that's how I was mentored. And it's how we all done it. Yeah, it comes from both sides too. It's not just the coaches that I'm talking about, but also like the sports medicine faculty, rehab professionals, strength coaches. Now everyone wants to talk. Everyone wants to learn from one another and just try to get the best outcome. So
yeah, I think if you're not willing to try new things, as long as it's within a safe framework. I mean, why do we drive cars as opposed to ride horses to work? Why do we not just do straight leg raises and quad sets? We do other functional. We look at the hip, we look at the glute activation. We look at all these things with a knee injury. Well, we did that because we tried new things from a post-surgical side.
Yeah.
I just did a talk up at Seattle a couple weeks ago, and it's funny to bridge the gap with coaches, I use the video from Tommy Boy, where they go in to sell these brake pads, and they go in to sell them to these different companies, and they go right in and they say no, and they're like, all right, have a great day, and they just leave, and sometimes it's like that talking to a coach or to an athlete that's like, hey, I have my own routine, I know what I want to do. We're very blessed here to have a coaching staff that we communicate with back and forth, and there's some things that we can do and some things that we can't, and other things that they ask about. And I think that's the importance of sports science. Where it needs to go is you get a lot of the technologies that sometimes are a black box where you don't understand what's coming in to what's outputting, and you really need to know all the granularity of it so you can educate your athletes on it, as opposed to saying, hey, we're going to jump on this force plate once a week or multiple times a week or once a month, and you're not really educating them on what they're getting out of it. Mm-hmm. Same with coaches, or same with your own staff. The more you can educate on it, the more buy-in you create, and then you create a culture, and they can understand that in their language. So they're like, okay, well, here's what I also have a problem with. How is this affecting it how's that showing up on the force plate? So you kind of get this back and forth dialogue, and sometimes the dialogue starter is just as important as whatever technology you're implementing.
Yeah. So with that being said, I think a lot of people that are probably tuning in, and I know myself, you just brought up the force plates again. Like, I'm curious. I want to know, so you do all this testing with the force plates. Well, what's next? What are some of these performance protocols? What have the guys maybe been working on? Of course, that you're willing to share and you can share. I know some leagues it's different. Like, sometimes people want to share stuff, and other times it's what's the word that I'm looking for? It's a very proprietary thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it does get tough on stuff to share, but there's a lot of technologies out there. You're getting force plate insoles now, where people are running through and they're creating 3D movement patterns based on accelerometry and force insoles.
Crazy.
And gait mechanics. And so I think not only just force plates alone, but like velocity-based training from in the weight room, how fast they move in that bar. From a rehab perspective, if you're tracking all that while you're training, and then they have an injury, they have surgery, and throughout that rehabilitation process, you have some benchmarks to gradually work up to. And then you can kind of pick that apart, as opposed to whether it be a jump or a squat, you can say, hey, let's work on your load phase first. Well, you're not loading as fast or as forceful through the squat or through the jump. Let's work on different strategies we know how to enable you to load better or to receive force better. And then you kind of are going through a progressive approach on how to increase the strength in those patterns, if you will. And so I think going forward, some of the things coming down the pipeline are probably going to be some virtual reality technology that's going to change the way you're doing, a balance exercise, where a guy might feel like he's standing on a beam, between two buildings, or he's standing on a small boat on water, but he's going to get those neurological, real life feeling sensations, and put them in different stressful environments from a VR standpoint. I think the movement analysis is starting to get really good.
Yeah,
I think that's a thing where it's getting more accurate. It's the same thing with force plates. Not to bring those up again, but in the past, when you would jump, the technology softwares weren't there to where it would take maybe 4 or 5 days to analyze one jump. Well, now you can analyze them almost in real time. So if you have 70 people jump 3 times, it's 210 jumps, and then you have, let's say 100 metrics per jump. That's 21,000 metrics you have in a matter of 20 minutes.
Crazy.
Yeah. So it's a lot. And I think, and by no means do we have all this figured out. It's a continual learning process, just like it is from the ACL progression, from casting them to let's move them early to let's do prehab, then let's do surgery. let's work on the glute, let's work on the front hip, let's work on the contralateral side. So I think a lot of it is just a progressive education approach.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because when I first started practicing, none of the docs were referring people for ACL prehab versus right before I left, I had a patient that had a follow-up with a doc, and he pushed back to surgery because the knee still wasn't fully getting straight and fully bending. Like a very small little thing that he still wanted to be perfect. And I was like, this is great. It just makes the outcome that much better.
Yeah, it does. And it's understanding, like, I'm sure in certain sports, think about your pregame, whether it be football or whether it be basketball or whether it be lacrosse or soccer. Let's say your soccer warm-ups almost induces as much fatigue as the first 20 minutes of the game. Well, that's probably not the best approach.
Yeah.
You want to get warmed up, but you also don't want to play the game before the game.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's taking those objective measurements and understand where your cost on the body is occurring and what's the best approach to match the demands that's going to have to undertake.
Yeah. I think what I'm very excited is everything that professionals are doing that's being done at the highest level. How can it continue to get implemented so that it's available and accessible to everyone? Small towns, small clinics, youth sports. Oh my God, that's such a mess. The workload on youth sports has gotten completely out of control.
Oh yeah, everything's specialized nowadays. I mean, they almost play as many games as MLB if you're on a traveling baseball team.
Yeah.
I think it takes. Again, I think I hate to harp on education, but at some point a lot has to start with education.
Yeah.
From the collegiate level, from the professional level to the collegiate level to the high school level to the coaches to everybody involved.
Yeah.
To make sure that, and sometimes too, it's going to be a roll your sleeves up, and it's not going to be this flashy sports science, but sometimes it's going to be, and I've done some projects like this, sometimes it's film review and you just have to manually track how far they're going with certain, and it's tedious, but if that's the only avenue, then that's what you have to do. If you buy one Garmin watch on a high school team and you rotate it on your hardest work days by each position, you can kind of come up with some positional norms. That's light years ahead of where you were the year before. Yeah. So you can say, okay, well, now let's look at what our games are. Well, man, our linebackers are practicing at 4,000 yards and the game's only running 2,000. Like, we're probably not sending them in a fresh state. We're probably putting them at risk.
Yeah.
Some of those, that problem solving to make your training as efficient and intentful as possible is the biggest, in my opinion.
I find every single patient that I work with, the things that they become much more aware of and how it all adds to your workload, the smallest things. And it's cool. It's exciting. Everything falls back to education. So how does someone get into your shoes? If there's someone that's tuned in right now that's like, dude, I want to be like Tyler. Like, I want to be in that chair. I want to get into sports science. What advice would you give to, say, someone's in high school or someone's in college, or they even have a career and they're ready for a career change?
Yeah. A lot of people that are kind of in my shoes at this point in time were kind of self-taught a little bit, just because the field was just in flux so much, the technology so fast, and there was no real true education aspect or opportunity behind it. I think ACU out of Australia does a great job. I think they have an online program. I think they've paired with Notre Dame and potentially another university to start an actual sports science degree and a full-on education process. A lot of other schools that are starting to kind of get into that sports science world are, I think, USC, I think Michigan.
Yeah, USC started a couple years ago.
Is really trying to drive that program, and I think it's a master's of kinesiology with an emphasis in sports science.
Correct.
And a lot of it is just taking that time to just read. I felt like I read more in the last 7 years than what I did all in school. Reading stuff from authors like um, Alan McCall or Tim Gabbett or Aaron Coots that have been doing GPS research for decades now with team sports, or like an Alan McCall. I know before the Nordboard, he was doing isometric resisted hamstring on blood pressure cuffs
Mm-hmm.
to understand the difference. So I think some of these people that have been doing it have paved the way for that for decades. It's just really just finding a topic, whether it be workload management, force plates, muscle testing, whatever it might be, and just read. There's also some conferences, sports science conferences that you can attend. So to me, it started.
The workload ratio. That's one of the easiest things that I give to my patients, and for everyone tuning in, it's like, okay, well, how can I even start managing my workload, or what is workload? We talked about in the beginning. It's do an RPE scale and just measure how long your workouts are, and just start with that. And you can do a simple equation. You just multiply, and then you look at your workload for the week. You look at it for the month, and then there's equations out there that compare, well, are you in the sweet spot? Not enough stimulus, over stimulus. So
Yeah, I think it's those small differences that add up to being big changes. Meaning, like, if you have a guy and he gets some swelling on his knee coming back from an injury, and if you didn't track it, you're going to have no idea of knowing. But if you're tracking it, like you're exactly the example you used, man, when I multiplied my duration by my RPE, my workload was like really high for 5 days in a row. Well, no wonder. Like, even a healthy individual is probably going to have a decrease, or an increase in fatigue, or a decrease in performance, or just longer. You know how it is if you have a big leg day in the weight room and you go down and sit down the next day. Your eccentric duration is a little longer, right?
Yeah.
So I think taking those other components into it, of being able to objectively measure or subjectively measure consistently, gives you an avenue to kind of follow your trail back and see. And most of the time, if not all the time, there's a reason behind why you're sore, why you're swollen, or why you feel good. And it's finding those trends and then those patterns and trying to repeat the ones that are successful and mitigate or limit the ones that are hindering.
And you brought up earlier in the talk, a word that Arash loves using is reverse engineering. And we do it with every goal that we want with the business. Whenever we meet, it's like, okay, well, we want to work on this project or this task. Let's just start with what it is at the end and then work backwards. And for me, with my training, like I have logs of everything. I use a wearable. And it's not like I have an Excel sheet. I'll write everything down every now and then, but I'm not necessarily doing it to make plans moving forward. It's something for me to reflect on and look at for if I want to make plans in the future, or just like you're saying, it's like any business or anything. If something goes wrong, it's like, well, let's take a look at the books. Like, what was going on at that time? You should be able to do the same thing with your own body and your physical health. If you reflect back, if you measured it, then you can manage it.
And that's the biggest thing for sports science from my side is measure everything you can, because then you can try to figure out some cause and effect.
Yeah.
You can figure out the why behind some of these things are happening, but if you're not measuring it, you have no chance.
Yeah.
Because you can't improve what you can't measure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we know that guy got stronger on his bench press or his squat because his numbers went up on the bar. And in essence, you're measuring that. Whether you're writing it down or not, you know that you benched 300 pounds compared to 250 pounds.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of measuring that process.
So a comment rolled in, and I'm sure we can talk about this a little bit. I'd like to get your opinion, but in summary, Rudy92 wants to know, sports science can engage in any way with athlete development positions. Interested to see if there's any crossover between these disciplines. What would you say?
Meaning what type of disciplines? Meaning like the difference between sports medicine and strength, or nutrition, or
Yeah, we'll see if maybe he follows up with us.
Yeah.
But I think you talked about
especially
it earlier in terms of just different positions, right? It's managing workload, and it's on Sunday, these guys played. This is how far they ran. This is how many minutes they got. All off season, you prepped for that because you understood what the workload would be. And then in season during the week, those guys, they may not train as hard as the guys that got less minutes that maybe weren't in the game. We'll see.
Yeah, I think sports science can engage in the development of athlete from multidisciplinary approach. Meaning, if you're a sports psychologist, or if you are a player engagement director, whether it's for whatever sport, on working on the development of that human being and athlete, there's a lot of different technologies that measure how these guys are reacting to decisions, how stressed they are. How there's a lot of technologies out there right now that are measuring how they're learning. Are they a visual learner? Are they an auditory learner? What is their innate traits of learning styles, and how are we matching up to that, to how we're teaching them the sport, or teaching them how to manage their life, or their training. So I think from a crossover standpoint, I think it can cross over just about anything. Whether you're a coach, I think sports science is important because at any given time, you're gaining insightful information on the state of your athlete.
Yeah.
So I think that's the approach. It's not that, hey, this sports science is, Excel spreadsheets, data, and algorithms. It's more, hey, we're gaining more information to make a better informed decision. Yeah. And we're not letting the data dictate our decisions. We're enhancing our guts and our clinician skills and our strength coaches skills, or our coaching experience, to make better, more accurate decisions. We're getting closer to the bullseye and the dartboard. We're not out in the outer rings anymore.
Yeah. It's really cool. It's exciting. Definitely have to keep in touch because I just love to hear what's happening in another 7 years.
Yeah, and I think it's a great field for people to kind of dive into, and you can attack different small avenues. It doesn't have to be this huge overhaul at the very beginning. Some of it's extremely small. We started super small and just let's track one thing, and then one thing led to another. As you start answering questions, you start asking more refined questions.
Yeah.
So it's like one thing kind of leads to another, and it'll snowball, but you got to start somewhere.
Exactly. Just one thing at a time, start one day at a time, and that's the easiest way to do it. So I think that's great. On a closing note, Tyler, how can people reach you? And I'll include this in the show notes.
They can shoot me an email on tywill815@gmail, or on my Twitter or Instagram account, and I can send that to you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and I hope everyone that tuned in enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening to this podcast with Tyler and I. If you enjoyed this one, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. It tremendously helps with getting the word out about our education and our information. If you really enjoyed the topic of sports science, check out the show notes where you'll be able to find Tyler's email. He'll be happy to answer any questions or concerns that you have. Take care.